Everybody, welcome to Biblical Reflections as we look through the stories of the book of Genesis and we try to find meaning in our own lives gleaned from the stories that the Torah shares with us. We are in the middle of the story of the binding of Isaac. We're going to focus on it this week and we're going to conclude that story next week. Next Monday night will be the last class of the winter semester before the Passover break, and then we're going to come back right after Passover. And we're going to start with our next story of the Bible, a story that deals with as Isaac is now the patriarch of the Jewish people and his dealings with his twin children. We'll be dealing with that after Passover. We go through the blessings that Isaac wants to give to his son Esau and ends up in the hands of Jacob. But right now, let's get right back to the binding of Isaac. We put 4 questions out there for discussion. Question number 1, why was this test more difficult than any of the prior 9 tests that Abraham experienced? Question number 2, why was it called a test for Abraham and not a test of faith for Isaac? After all, Isaac was the one to be sacrificed. Question number 3, why the need to repeat the binding of Isaac so often as it's repeated daily in our prayers? And question number 4, which we spent a great deal of time last week and the week before on, and we'll continue discussing, was God not already convinced of Abraham's faith before the binding of Isaac? Didn't Abraham already prove his total faith, his real Mesirat Nefesh, his self-sacrifice, his willingness to do anything and everything for God? If God already knew the outcome, why put Abraham through the pain and the anguish of this challenge of faith of the binding of his son, the son that he loves, of Isaac? And as I mentioned, the more we look into the story of the binding of Isaac, the more we see that it has layers. I call them dimensions. Today, we're going to focus on 5 dimensions of the binding of Isaac. Next week, we'll do the 6th dimension, which will really incorporate all of the 5 that we're going to talk about today. So, dimension number 1. Abraham waited for 100 years for the birth of a child with Sarah. Okay, he waited 100 years for this great miracle. As God says to him, Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son, and you shall call him Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him and with his descendants after him. It's been made clear to Abraham that there will be a son born to Sarah, and that son will be the heir to this mission, to this light unto the nations group that was to come forth from them, to the nation that will bring blessings to all the families of the earth. It's going to be led by the son that will be born to Sarah. And it was a great miracle for Abraham and Sarah. A son, Isaac, is born in their old age, a son that will inherit the mission and will inherit the land of Israel. And it will be he that will carry the blessings that was said unto Abraham about making them a great nation. After Isaac is born, Abraham and Sarah have no other children. Abraham will have children of his own after Sarah passes away. But Abraham and Sarah together will have no other children other than Isaac. And therefore, all rests on the shoulders of Isaac. And for 37 years, Isaac is raised and he's educated by Abraham and Sarah. And it's clear from the Torah, from the teachings of the Torah, that Isaac was growing up to be a worthy successor of Abraham. Unlike Ishmael, which the Torah tells us very clearly is not growing up in the footsteps of Abraham, is a wild individual, is involved in thievery. Now Ishmael himself will repent towards the end of his life. But while he's growing up, he's clearly not fit for the role of the next patriarch. Isaac is everything that the Torah tells us about Isaac, that he's growing up, following the footsteps of his father, Abraham. So everything seems fine. Abraham is aging, Sarah is aging, we're coming close to the end of their lives, but Isaac is there. He's already 37 years old, he is already groomed, he's ready for the position. Everything is perfect until suddenly this verse comes at us and says, please take your son, your only son, the one that you love, Isaac, and travel to the land of Moriah and bring him up as an offering on the mountain that I will show you. With one statement, one verse in the Torah, one sentence, doubt and confusion is brought on the very future of a Jewish people. How will it continue? How can it continue? Who's going to lead? If there is no Isaac, and Abraham is already quite old, when Abraham passes away, does it mark the end of the mission? Is it over? Is the experiment over? And why should the experiment be over? The experiment was actually working quite well. For the very first time, we have a human being, and now a human being and his followers willing to stand up for God, willing to stand up for morality, willing to stand up for goodness, unlike all the generations from Adam through Noah up until Abraham. It's the first time we have people sensing responsibility for their period of time, for their era, and for the goodness of their generation. So if the experiment wasn't working, we can say God said, hey, I tried, it's not working out. But the experiment of having a human being responsible for their generation was working perfectly. And Isaac is growing up perfectly to succeed exactly as God had laid out the plan. So why suddenly do we get this verse, bring him as an offering? Furthermore, Abraham had built up a following of people. I mentioned this last week. People knew of him. People learned from him. People followed his teachings. He was a leader that gained respect wherever he went. And what was the focus of his teachings? The focus of his teachings was that people should emulate God. God who hates cruelty and loves kindness. Abraham is speaking to a generation that believed in idol worship. They practiced idol worship. And the generation, this particular generation that worshiped idols, performed human sacrifices before these idols. They spilled human blood. They slaughtered their own children before their gods. Abraham comes along and says, this is not God. You don't slaughter a human being in the name of God, for God. God is a God of love. God is a God that embraces people. The human being is created in the image of God. And God despises cruelty and loves kindness. That's what Abraham preached. What would happen to all of his followers if indeed he carried out the instructions of God and actually slaughtered his son? As we read this verse, if we read it for the very first time, and suppose you're studying it for the first time and you don't know the end of the story, you didn't see any of the films on the Bible, and you didn't study in Hebrew school what happens here at the end, and you get to this verse, you tell me your confusion. Tell me what you're thinking of this buildup. Everything we studied about the generation of Adam, everything we studied about the generation of Noah, everything we studied about the generation of the Tower of Babel, about the failure of man. And along comes an Abraham, and everything that we have studied already about Abraham and the grooming of Isaac. And suddenly I present to you this verse that God says, bring him to a mountain and slaughter him there. Bring him as an offering. What would you think at that time if you don't know the end of the story? Because Abraham, when he hears this verse, doesn't know the end of the story. So everything that he preached, everything that he brought about to bring followers in was in jeopardy. They would hear that Abraham violated the very teachings he so strongly preached against. His entire life's work would be nullified and wasted in one action. He would be ridiculed by the entire world as a hypocrite, one who preached one way and practiced another. And what would happen with the belief in God? What would happen with monotheism? It would be washed down the drain. Who's going to believe in an individual that preached this monotheism, a God that loves, a God that despises cruelty, when he's slaughtering his son to this God? So this belief in one God, this belief in one moral voice in this world that Abraham worked so hard to teach would have been discredited, perhaps for good. Could another such experiment ever come up? And with whom? If it didn't work with Abraham, who's it going to work with? The human being can withstand much pain in life, but the most difficult struggle of all is disgrace. And he must have known that upon his return from the mountain, after doing the act, doing the deed, disgrace is what awaited him. Disgrace for Abraham, disgrace for his teachings, and worst of all, a disgrace and a mockery of the God that he worked so hard to introduce to society. That's dimension number one of how great of a challenge this was for Abraham. We haven't touched yet the love that he has for Isaac. We haven't touched that yet. Right now, it's a philosophical question. How can it be all these promises, all of this experiment building up to blessings to all the families of the earth, change the world forever, all from Abraham onto Isaac, and now you want me to slaughter Isaac? That's dimension number one of understanding how strong, how great of a challenge of his faith this was. And yet for Abraham, there was no doubt, there was no confusion, and there was no hesitation. Abraham was asked by God to perform a deed. And his love for God and his awe for God and his desire to fulfill God's commandment was all that Abraham focused on. That's all he can think about. And the consequences, and there would be many consequences, is not something that's on his mind right now. Right now, this is what God has asked of me. Why? I really do not know. What will be? I do not know. Why is it so? I do not know. But I do know that God has asked me to do this. That's dimension number one. Let's move on. Dimension number two. Verse after verse, in the portions of Lech Lecha Vayera, the third and the fourth portion of the Torah, tells us about the promises and blessings that God gave to Abraham concerning his descendants. It would only be natural for Abraham to have wondered what would be with all these promises of God if indeed he carried out the sacrifice. If this is the will of God right now for me to bring him as an offering, I'm willing to accept that. But what was about the will of God yesterday, a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago? What about that will of God when it conflicts with the will of God that's speaking today? And would it have been so bad if Abraham just asked for clarification? I'm prepared to do whatever you would like, God, but I would like a point of clarification. You said, and finish the sentence, you told me that from Isaac will bring forth all of this mission that we spoke about. What's going to be if I slaughter him? I'm not withholding him. I'm willing to do it. I'm doing whatever you ask. I just have a question for you, God. Instead, we get the verse. He woke up early in the morning and he saddled his donkey and he's on his way to Mount Moriah because God asked him to. No questions asked. Because Abraham understood that listening to God, even if the command is beyond any comprehension whatsoever, is the ultimate in service of God. And he will hold nothing back, not his son, not his reputation, not his students, not his lifetime of achievement. It doesn't matter to Abraham that no one would understand him. It doesn't matter that he doesn't understand himself. What matters is that he's fulfilling the will of God. That's dimension number two, that he doesn't even ask God for clarification. Dimension number three, we cannot underestimate Isaac's role in the binding of Isaac. He is the one that's bound, right? He is the guy. He's the victim here. It's the Akedah of Isaac. He was to be the sacrifice. And we find verse after verse in the story of the Akedah that uses the words in Hebrew, I'll say it and translate it, Val Yelchu Sheneihem Yachtov. That means they went together. Yachtov literally means like hand in hand, but it's not just physically hand in hand. It's spiritually, it's mentally, it's emotionally, which means Isaac knew what was happening. At some point during this dramatic story, Isaac turns to his father. And he says to his father, I understand that we woke up early this morning because God told you he wants you to bring an offering. And I see that you're well prepared. You have the knife, you have the wood, you have everything that you need for this offering. But where is the sheep for the offering? Or to use the vernacular, if you remember the Walter Mondale versus Gary Hart campaign, you remember the main line of one of the debates where Mondale says to Gary Hart, where's the beef? It was a takeoff of a commercial that was going on for one of them restaurants, right? Where's the beef? Isaac asks Abraham, where's the beef? Where's the animal? The Dad, something doesn't make sense here. And Abraham says to his son, my dear son, God has selected the sheep. God has selected the sheep. And Isaac understands. Immediately thereafter, after this question and answer exchange of father and son that loved each other, it says a repeat. Vayelchu shneihem yachdav. They continue their journey hand in hand. Now they're partners. Before, Isaac is trying to figure out what's going on. Now he knows what's going on, and he continues this journey arm in arm with his father because he wants to be part of this as well. If this is what God wants, we're going to give it to God. We're going to do it for God. If this is what he wants, it's beyond our comprehension, but we will withhold nothing from God. Now, for those that believe that Isaac was a young child and he couldn't rebel, it's not true. He was stronger than his father at this stage. He was 37 years old. He could have said, Dad, you're insane, you're senile, this is not happening, I'm not part of this, and checked out. So Isaac is a partner in this just as much as his father. And if so, my question is, why do we always talk about this story as one of the 10 challenges of Abraham's faith? Why is it considered the final challenge of Abraham's faith? Why is it considered the greatest challenge of Abraham's faith? Why is it considered the most complete challenge of the Amunah and Betachon of Abraham? Why isn't it ever called the first challenge of challenge of faith of Isaac? It's called the binding of Isaac, but not the test of Isaac. Why? And the answer is that Isaac was indeed prepared to give up his life. As many Jews throughout history have demonstrated this ultimate sacrifice. Isaac would climb Mount Moriah and he would not have to descend. Isaac would not have to answer the world, what have you done with your son? He would not have to face his wife and explain that he slaughtered the son that she had awaited for so long and loved so much. He wouldn't have to sit in an empty home, empty of guests who would now refrain from his gesture of hospitality on account that he slaughtered his own son. They would have nothing to do with him. He would not have to face a more difficult tomorrow, for it would come to an end today. He's climbing the mountain, but he doesn't have to return. Unfortunately, tens of thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews, and may I say in our century, millions of Jews faced that moment of walking into a gas chamber knowing they're not walking out. And they put their hands over their eyes and they said, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. They pledged their faith to God. And they sang, Ani Mamin Be'amuna Shalema, I still believe with complete faith. So Isaac would climb the mountain and he would leave. He would stay there, stay with God in the heavenly world. But he wouldn't have to come back. He wouldn't have to come down the mountain. Isaac was being asked to die as a Jew. I'm not undermining. I'm not saying that I'm not belittling it, chas v'shalom, God forbid in any way. But you can't compare it to Abraham. Because Abraham was being asked to live on as a Jew after coming down the mountain. It would be he that would have to lift the knife to his son. He would have to carry it out and then climb down the mountain and then go to his wife's tent and then let the community know what happened to Isaac and still live on as a Jew. That challenge is just beyond our understanding how any human being can possibly face that. Dimension number 4. We are taught that each of the patriarchs served God with a different attribute. Abraham served God with chesed, with kindness. Everything about Abraham was kindness. Kindness. It's the way he treated all human beings with kindness. It's why he was so loved, because he was so kind. Isaac served God with what we call gevura. It was more of a severity, more of a strictness, a strength within him. Very different than Abraham. If Abraham is all outreach, Isaac is more on refining the self. And Jacob was called Tiferes, somewhere a combination between the two. A little bit of outreach, but at the same time of refining of their own soul. Everything we have learned about Abraham's life points us in the direction of a man of kindness. I mentioned last week, I don't remember if it's at this class or another class, that the Torah doesn't give us descriptions that it doesn't feel that we need. For instance, if I was to ask you, what does Abraham look like? You may think of a character, Abraham, that you saw in a Hollywood film, but you have absolutely no idea what he looked like. You don't know his height. You don't know the color of his eyes. You don't know anything about his looks because the Torah didn't define his looks. The Torah told us about Sarah that she was very, very pretty. Even in her elder years, she was prettier than all the women in Egypt. So we know that Sarah was very, very pretty. The Torah defines Leah. The Torah defines Rachel a little bit. But many characters, the Torah does not define appearances. The Torah tells us what we need to know. About Abraham, the Torah will continuously remind us over and over that this was a man of kindness who cared about people. Everything about Abraham was chesed, was kindness. Thus, when Abraham is asked by Sarah to send Ishmael away, rewind the clock a little bit. Remember, Ishmael is born before Isaac. Ishmael is born to a different wife, to a woman named Hagar. Hagar was the maid of Sarah, that Sarah comes up with the plan of surrogate motherhood, that she will give her maid to Abraham to marry so that she can raise a child that they will bear. The child is Ishmael. Ishmael is not growing up properly. Now that Isaac is born and Isaac is being raised in the same household as Ishmael, Sarah is concerned. I don't want Ishmael and Isaac being raised in the same home. I thought it was a good idea. It turns out it wasn't a necessary idea. We had a child between ourselves. Tell Hagar and Ishmael out of the house. Move back to where you come from. Say goodbye. It was very, very hard for Abraham. Very difficult for him. He had feelings for Hagar, and he definitely had feelings for his son Ishmael. So the verse tells us that when Sarah says this to him, send Ishmael and Hagar away, that Abraham didn't want to listen. He didn't want to go along with it. He loved Sarah very much, but he also had feelings here. And he couldn't do it. He has this midah, this attribute of kindness. And if you're a kind person, tough love doesn't work well. And he's being asked to practice tough love of sending them away from the home. It doesn't work. So he struggles with this gevura thing, this idea of being strict and tough. And it becomes very difficult for him to send his son Ishmael away. Even though Sarah has a logical reason for her request. She's explaining to Abraham logically why this needs to happen. She's explaining Isaac has to be groomed as the next patriarch of the most important nation that will continue this revolution of the world to bring goodness and kindness and godliness to the world. We must do everything to protect him, to protect his childhood. Having Ishmael around is not a good influence. So there's a logical explanation to her request. And yet the man of kindness has that emotion. And that emotion says to logic, I know it makes sense, but I can't do it. So follow me on this, right? The man of kindness, Abraham, is saying to Sarah, who's responding logically to him, to do something that makes sense. And Abraham is saying, I can't. Why? Because I have feelings. Enter the scene, God. God comes to Abraham, the verse says, and God says to Abraham, I'm listening to the argument taking place between you and your wife Sarah, and I'm mixing in, and I'm telling you that she is right, and you need to listen to her. It's time for Hagar and Ishmael to go. But God sees the pain that this causes Abraham and sees that Abraham is suffering emotionally from this request to send Ishmael away because he loves Ishmael. So God says to the man that he cares very much about, Abraham, who's now feeling pain, emotional pain for having to send Ishmael away. God says, look, I know this is hard for you. So I want to tell you something. I'm going to watch over him. And he too will be a great nation. So you're worried you're going to chase him away. Oy vey, I'm never going to see him again. Oy vey, what's going to happen to him? If he's wild now as a teenager, what's he going to be as he grows up? I'm telling you, it's going to be okay. And I'm God, and I'm infinite, and I see the future, and I know your pain, and I'm telling you not to worry. If you ever worried about a child of yours, a teenager, an adult, a kid, you're worried there may be a medical thing going on, an emotional thing, a problem in school. And imagine you were able to go to a prophet, to a holy person, and the holy person gives you a blessing and says, you can trust me on this. You feel a sense of relief. Imagine how it was God himself coming to you and saying, don't worry about your tatala. He's going to be okay. He's going through a stage. It's a phase in life, but don't worry. I see the future. It's all going to be great. You calm down, right? The pain dissipates a little bit. So God comes to Abraham, a man of chesed, a man of kindness, and he assures him that what Sarah is saying is correct. And he assures him that Ishmael will have a future as well. Now let's look at the binding of Isaac in comparison to that. The binding of Isaac challenged him not only to do something which was incomprehensible, right? No logic, where Sarah presented logic. There is no logic presented here, but also goes against his very essence, his personality of kindness. Everything that he is about, every essence part of his soul, of his body, can't make peace with this binding of Isaac. The binding of Isaac seems like compare that to sending Ishmael away. It's a different world. And if he struggled with the idea of sending Ishmael away, how is he supposed to receive this idea of slaughtering your own son as a man of kindness without there being any logical, comprehensible explanation given to him? That's dimension number 4. Now we'll build on that. If you're still paying attention, if you haven't dozed off, we're going to build on everything we just said for dimension number 5. And then next week, we're going to build on all of it with dimension number 6. This test becomes even more difficult by the very careful selection of words by God. God has a very small speaking part in the beginning of the story of the binding of Isaac. You know, the director gives out the scripts and every actor is looking over how many lines they got. God has a very small speaking role. Until at the end, he sends an angel to stop Abraham. But until we get to that point, he says one line, right? He just gives the instruction and then he's away from the scene. And we want to hear from him. What are you doing, God? Why are you doing this, God? Why are you telling? We have so many questions for God in this story. And yet he disappears from the scene. We're just seeing the scene of Abraham, right? You know, the split screen plays that you have. So suddenly the lights go out on the God stage. We don't hear from him, even though we have so many questions. But he says one important line. And I want you to pay attention to how carefully he selects his words of this line. He says to Abraham, Kach na es bincha. Please take your son. Okay. And then he adds, es yechitcha, your only son. And then he adds, asher ahavta, the one that you love. And then he says, es Yitzchak, Isaac. This is the opening line that he uses to tell Abraham of the mission to bring Isaac as an offering. And before we look into what the commentators say on these words, let's again look at the prior test of Abraham and compare. I want to keep coming back to that story of Sarah and Ishmael. Sarah sending Ishmael away. Let's go back to it again. Sarah wants Ishmael driven from the house. That becomes a difficult task for Abraham and is actually listed as one of the 10 tests of faith of Abraham that Abraham was challenged in his life. That God says, listen to Sarah, and he had to listen, was a challenge to Abraham because it was so difficult for him. Yet, as I pointed out, follow me on this, please. Sarah had a valid, justified reason for wanting Ishmael out of the house. She explains the reason to Abraham and in the text of the Torah to us, the audience. She tells us why. He's a bad influence on Isaac. We need to protect the environment of the home so that Isaac can grow up to be the next patriarch of the Jewish people. Agree or disagree, there's a logic being explained, okay? Abraham chooses to disagree, but a logic was presented to him and to us, the audience. Number two, God now mixes in, as I mentioned, and it instructs Abraham to listen to Sarah and tells us and Abraham that Sarah is correct, that her logic is right. Ishmael must be separated from Isaac in this phase of his life. God makes it clear. God's the ultimate judge. God tells us, the audience, even if you are uncomfortable, even if when you heard Sarah saying that, you cringed a little bit, I'm telling you that she's right. Okay, we have to give it to God because God knows better than we know. Number three, as mentioned earlier, God comes and comforts Abraham that Ishmael will survive and Ishmael will become a great nation. And although I explained earlier that it was difficult for a man of kindness like Abraham to send away his son, he knew with his own intellect that it was proper. He knew with his own intellect that it was justified. And he now knows beyond the shadow of a doubt that it's correct because God put his stamp of approval on it. So he knows it's right. And yet it's still difficult for him, and that's still counted as one of the challenges of faith of Abraham. Now I want you to do this side-by-side comparison. Follow me on this. That was test number 9. Let's take a look at test number 10 and compare it to test number 9. Number 1, there is no justification given for the death of Isaac. Nothing. Not that he failed, not that he's not living up to his potential. There was no mention of any sin on Isaac's part that he would be deserving of death. Right? Nothing. Number 3, there was no promise of the future. When Abraham felt bad for Ishmael, God comes along and God says, but don't worry, Abraham. I'm going to watch over him. I'm going to protect him. He's going to be a great nation. You just asked me to slaughter Isaac. There was no mention of don't worry. What if the verse would say, but don't worry, Abraham, Sarah's going to give birth to another child that's going to be even greater than this. It would still be painful, but at least there would be some explanation from God. Instead, we have silence. He disappears from the scene. He drops a bombshell here, a bombshell of a commandment, and he leaves. By Ishmael, test number 9, he feels bad for Abraham, that Abraham has to go through such emotional turmoil. And he says, don't worry, I'll watch over him. He's going to be a great nation. There are no words of comfort coming from God to Abraham like there was by every test that Abraham faced. Nothing. What do we find, however? The very opposite. Now follow me on that opening line. Please take your son. The commentaries explain your son means that he remains the status of your son, meaning he is the perfect son. He's following in your footsteps. He too is a complete tzaddik. He is a holy, holy individual. God continues. Your only son. He is still the only son that can inherit the mission of Abraham. He is still the only son, for there will not be another son from Sarah. So he's called your only son because he is the only son. I already disqualified Ishmael, and I'm telling you now that it will not be from any other offspring that you will give birth. Then God continues. It gets better. He says, whom you love. If God says the son that you love, he's saying, and he deserves your love. God wants to make it clear to Abraham that Isaac is not being punished. Rather, on the contrary, the greatness of Isaac is being emphasized in this verse. Your son, he is deserving of being your son. Your only son, there won't be another one like Isaac. The one that you love, and he deserves that love. So whereas the case by Ishmael, God's words to Abraham made it easier for Abraham to understand why Ishmael indeed needed to be sent from the home. In the case of the binding of Isaac, the very opposite is true. God is building up the love that Abraham has for Isaac. He's intensifying the love, thus making the words and offer him as a sacrifice totally illogical. The challenge intensifies greatly with every word of God. There can be no greater nachas. There can be no greater love than one can have for a child. When God himself comes to you and compliments and praises your son. You know, if you experience this, how you felt when you got a note from a teacher that told you that your kid is excelling in class, right? You get this note or a comment on the report card, your son, your daughter is doing exceptionally well. Tell me how it felt when you read it. You felt good. You experienced nachas. Now suppose it's not a comment on the report card. Now suppose they write you a letter. I want you to know I took the time to write you because I want you to know how special, how bright, how this and that your child is. Wow, do you feel nachas, right? That's what nachas is. You feel good. You raise your child and it's succeeding. You did something right in life, right? Valedictorian, right? They get selected to be valedictorian. They score high on their SATs. Nachas, right? They graduate from college with honors. Nachas. But there can be no greater nachas than God himself coming to you and saying, my gosh, you've raised your child perfectly. Perfectly. So imagine you get to that height of nachas that you can't get any higher than that. That God himself comes and puts his stamp of approval on the way you raised him. You can't do any better. He is your son. He is your only son. He is the son that you love. And he deserves that love because he's exceptional. And then boom, he lowers it right away on Abraham by saying, and that son that you love, that deserves your love, that's your only son, I want you to bring to this mountain and offer him as a sacrifice. There can be no greater challenge of a human being than what God sets up Abraham here for, by it going completely against everything Abraham represents, everything that he practiced in his life, everything that he preached in his life, every ounce of his being that was so filled with love. And here this one sentence of God throws it all in turmoil. That's why the binding of Isaac stands out from all other tests. All other tests were difficult, but he had God cheering him on. He had God explaining it to him. He had Sarah explaining it to him. He had his own logic. He knew he needed to stand up to Nimrod. His own logic told him he needed to stand up to Nimrod. Life is not worth living if I have to worship a king that claims he's God. If logic is helping you do what you do, it is a challenge. It's difficult. It's hard. But logic is helping you. If the challenge is something that your emotion is helping you with, you can get through it even though it's difficult. But when the challenge of faith goes completely against everything you think, everything you believe, everything you know, then you have the epitome, the absolute challenge of faith that no human being ever experienced, unlike this human being at this particular time. With all of the above in mind, I said we still have dimension number 6, which I call the Hasidic dimension, which we'll tackle next week. We have a better and clearer understanding of why the binding of Isaac was indeed the 10th and most difficult test for Abraham, and why there would no longer be a need to test his faith once the binding was complete. Because he would have reached the epitome of serving God with total self-sacrifice, complete self-sacrifice. This would be nothing but self-sacrifice, meaning the sacrificing of self. Because there's no part of me that has any logical understanding of what's going on here. And therefore, I am completely giving over the self, giving it over to God's instruction. Not only does Abraham not question God when given the instructions, the verse tells us that he gets up early in the morning because he wanted to rush to fulfill the commandment of God, even a commandment as difficult as this one. He saddles his own donkey, which means he wasn't going to wait for some servant to come along. There's no hesitation, there's no complaining, and there's no doubts. The Alter Rebbe writes in the book of Tanya that the most remarkable aspect of the binding of Isaac, of the Akedah, was the eagerness that Abraham demonstrated to carry out God's command, even while setting aside all of his personal feelings. As to why we call it the binding of Isaac, and I'll conclude tonight with that. Why do we call it the binding of Isaac? Why then don't we call it the Nisayon of Abraham, the epitome, the ultimate challenge of Abraham? It's called by the name Akedas Yitzchak. It's called the binding of Isaac, and yet, as I said, it's the 10th and most difficult challenge of faith of Abraham. So then why don't we call it after Abraham's name? Why is it binding of Isaac? To answer this question, let's start with another question. Why do we use the term binding altogether? The binding seems to be such an important part of the story that the entire episode is called after the binding of Isaac. Well, what's odd? God never tells Abraham to bind Isaac. You don't find it anywhere in the instructions that he's supposed to bind him. And yet we call it the binding of Isaac. He was told to offer him as an offering. It doesn't say anything about binding. So the Medrash tells us that the binding came about by Isaac himself. Isaac was the one that asked. And he tells his father, please bind me, because I don't want to move during the sacrifice and make the sacrifice unfit. When there's the slaughter of an animal, it has to be a perfect slaughter. And there can't be movement of the animal suddenly, because that would make the sacrifice, the slaughtering, considered unfit. Isaac says, Dad, if we're doing this, let's do it perfectly. So I'm asking you as a favor, Dad, bind me. The reason we name this whole story Binding of Isaac is it shows us the character of these two individuals and what they're thinking at the time when they're being asked to make the ultimate sacrifice. What are they thinking of? If we're doing this, let's do it right. So please bind me, Dad. Their only concern was to fulfill the will of God and make certain that it was done properly. Thus, the Akedah is highlighted. The binding is highlighted because it shows us the extent that their willingness was, how far they were willing to go to carry out the will of God. We'll continue and we'll conclude the story of the binding of Isaac next week. And as I mentioned, that will be the last of the winter semester, but have no fear, right after Passover, we're going to start up all over again, and we're going to move on to the next story of the